presentations from MOFPI, CFTRI, IIFPT as well, and there is a representation from these organizations also. Without wasting any more time, I would like to introduce you to the first speaker for today. Just give me a second. I'm going to share my screen. I hope my screen is visible to everyone. So we have with us today Dr. Jasvir Singh ji. He is the Regulatory, Scientific and Government Affairs leader in international flavors and fragrances. Sir has worked in the areas of quality, food safety and regulatory affairs with esteemed organizations like Mondelez, ITC, SGS, Food Research and Analysis Center and Jagatjeet Industries. He has also provided his expertise in laboratory quality management systems to the government of Vietnam as a technical expert for FAO. He's a member of various committees and task forces of both government as well as industry associations. His areas of interest are regulatory and public policy framework in the areas of science, technology, and publications. So that's about the introduction of Dr. Jasveer ji. Over to you, Dr. Singh, and we are very glad that you could take time out of your busy schedule and you have agreed to conduct this session as a speaker on this particular topic. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Preetha, for this generous introduction. Let me share my screen. Can somebody confirm if?
Yes, sir. It's visible. You can put. Yeah, it's perfectly visible, sir.
Okay. So thanks, Preetha, once again, and good evening, everybody. So I will be talking about food contact materials, or what is generally referred as packaging materials in our everyday language, and how regulations are evolving so as to ensure consumer safety when it comes to this area of food contact materials globally. So first, when we look at the definition of food contact materials, you can see that these are defined in different ways in different regulations. And some of the very important regulations in this area are European regulations as well as US regulations, apart from the local regulation that we have in India. So, European regulation defines food contact materials with certain characteristics. And those characteristics are that first, they are intended to be brought into contact with food, and you need to look at the implications of using the word intended. Uh, so that means by design, they were meant to be brought into contact with food, whereas in reality, they may or may not be in contact with food at a certain point of time. The second characteristic is that they are already in contact with food and they were intended for that purpose, or they can reasonably be expected to be brought into contact with food or to transfer their constituents to food under normal or foreseeable conditions of use. So this pretty much covers all the possibilities around a particular material so as to classify it under food contact materials. And when you look at the US way of regulating it, you can see that these are substances which are intended for use as a component of materials, used in manufacturing, packing, packaging, transporting, or holding food, but with a qualifier that such use is not intended to have a technical effect in such food. So these materials are used only for the purpose of manufacturing, packing, packaging, etc. But the intention of their use is not to have a technical effect in the finished food. And if such materials have a technical effect in the finished food, then such materials actually get into the area which is regulated as food additives and not as food contact materials. Um, so apart from this definition of food contact materials, this particular slide will give you a view on the complexity which is involved in this whole world of regulating packaging materials or food contact materials. There are various regulations, and each one of them is brought into force with a certain perspective or with a certain objective. And we can see that if you look at the products involved, then these materials can be regulated in the areas of foods or drugs or chemicals or other such materials. If you look at consumer information, then it is regulated through labeling regulations. If you look at the perspective of pack sizes, then you are dealing with legal metrology. If you are looking at suitability for end use, the specific intended end use, then you are looking at areas of quality, safety, compliance and tolerance criteria, as well as the testing methodologies involved. And when you are looking at authorization procedures, so you are looking at FCN framework which exists in US or similar frameworks which exist in other countries. So FCN framework is the food contact materials notification framework which exists in US. And when you look at environmental and sustainability concerns, you have to deal with the recycling, you have to deal with plastic waste management rules, and many other such areas. So you can see that this whole area of packaging materials intersects with the regulations at multiple touch points, and it depends on what is your perspective. But in all such areas, you are regulating packaging materials in one way or the other. If you look at the basic regulatory principle which has been used at least till now, when looking at various ways and means of regulating food contact materials, the basic principle is that any material or any article which is intended to come into contact directly or indirectly with a food product must be sufficiently inert. That's the principle, that the packaging material has to be inert so that this does not add any such substance into the food which ultimately results in creating some sort of danger to human health. And this transfer uh, can be above the levels which are required to create that negative impact on human health. And the second is that it has to be sufficiently inert so as to preclude an unacceptable change in the composition of the finished food or a deterioration in its organoleptic properties. So, this basic principle of ensuring inertness of packaging material so that this does not add any such material into food which creates a negative impact on human health, or it creates a negative impact on the acceptability of food. That's the basic principle which is used across the globe till now to determine whether a packaging material or a food contact material is fit for use as a food contact material or not. And that we will see how this principle gets implemented across geographies. So that was the principle, and that principle gets implemented in various ways. And some of these typical ways or typical measures which are used by regulations is that there are substances which are authorized for use in manufacturing such materials and articles. That means you create uh, those list of substances which are approved for use in manufacturing these materials or these articles. The second way of regulating it can be that you create a list of such substances which are approved for addition into active or intelligent food contact materials. The third component of regulating is that you establish purity criteria, or what we generally call as purity criteria, as well as specifications for such materials, so that only those materials which comply to this purity criteria as well as specifications can be used in food contact applications. Uh, then you can also create a regulation which specify conditions of use for these substances. Another very common measure is to specify the limits on migration, and that limit can deal with migration of certain specific constituents or groups of such constituents, or an overall general limit on migration of constituents into food. Another measure can be around dealing with hazards that can arise from using food contact materials uh, when you have an oral contact. Then Uh, there are basic rules, criteria which are required for checking compliance to whatever regulations you put in place. And that uh, rules for checking compliance also require establishment of methods of collecting samples and then carrying out analysis for various parameters which are specified. And in addition, you can also have certain regulations which can provide measures to deal with labeling of active or intelligent materials or articles. So, the same principle of ensuring inertness that manifests itself in various ways, and these 10 examples these 8 examples are just some of the examples to show how you can create or how you can convert the same principle into regulations. And when you look at the global regulatory landscape around food contact materials, one thing that you will notice is that regulations are still evolving in a large majority of countries because packaging material so far either was not treated as an area of urgency, or they had some indirect ways of controlling that in many countries around the world. But there are reference points, and more countries are now moving into this domain of having specific regulations around food contact materials. And some of the early movers in this area were US and European Union regulations. So US FDA has established a food contact notification process where uh, you basically give the information around food contact material to FDA with all the scientific data uh, to establish safety, and then FDA looks at that data and conducts its own review and then give you either a no objection letter or a formal notification, which is sort of permission to use that food contact material. Whereas Europe has established a separate regulation, which is 1935, which was issued in 2004, and that regulation deals with the materials which are intended to come into contact with the foods. And this has certain lists or positive lists associated with this regulation, which have been established uh, by looking at EFSA's approval process. So, those of you who know Europe's regulatory framework for food, you know that the formal regulations are issued by European Union, but they all are issued on the basis of a scientific advice or risk assessment, which is carried out by the risk assessment body of Europe, which is called as EFSA, European Food Safety Authority. So European Food Safety Authority conducts the scientific review of the applications and then determines whether those materials are safe, not safe, or gives comments on that. And that opinion is then converted into a regulation by European Union. Uh, so if you look at some of the details of the US regulation, so it is a pre-market notification for a food contact substance. And there are multiple ways in which you can submit that notification to FDA. And then FDA has about 120 days to review that submission. And those details are available in CFR, which is code for federal regulations, numbering 21 CFR 170.100 to 100.06. And there is a form 3480 which can be submitted electronically as well, which has all the data requirements. And you can create a sort of confidentiality arrangement as well. Once the review has been done by US FDA, you get an acknowledgement letter or an effective letter, and finally a listing on food contact notification website where you have the listing of the food contact substance, name of the notifier, as well as intended use of these food contact substances, which are listed there. And that's how you can finally use these materials for applications. Whereas Europe's framework is quite complicated. and you can look at this. There's an overall framework of 1935, which is applicable across Europe. Then there are certain specific regulations around regenerated cellulose films, ceramics, plastic materials, elastomers, and all the other materials which you can see on screen. These are also applicable across European Union. And finally, certain member countries, they have specific requirements which are applicable only in that country of Europe. And these are also available. So it's a pretty complex framework which is applicable in Europe as of now. Now let's come to the main area of the regulations which exist in India. If you look at the history, uh, before Food Safety and Standards Authority was established, there was this framework of PFA, or Prevention of Food Adulteration Act, uh, and that had a combined packaging and labeling rules. So when FSSAI was established, the same rules were converted into Food Safety and Standards Packaging and Labeling Regulations in 2011. And then a revision exercise of those regulation was started. So you got the first draft in 2018, which continued the old as well as brought in some of the new areas into regulations, and it finally split this whole regulatory framework into two. One which was dealing with labeling part, the other which was dealing with packaging. So labeling regulation has been separately developed and notified recently, and that is becoming effective this year. Whereas the packaging regulation was notified in 2018, and that regulation is now applicable in India as final regulation since 2019. So that's the history uh, behind this whole packaging regulation. And if you look at this regulation, there are certain definitions which has been brought in. So this gives you a definition of multiple terms which are used in regulation. One important addition was defining food grade, because before this regulation, the term food grade was used in many places, and almost everybody would go and ask from packaging material vendors that give me food grade certification. But there was no regulatory definition available for this term food grade. So this term got defined through this regulation. So when you talk food grade, this means that the material made of substances which are safe and suitable for their intended use and shall not endanger human health or result in unacceptable changes in the composition of food or organoleptic characteristics. So this, you can see that this concept is emerging from the same concept which I mentioned in the beginning of ensuring inertness of that food contact material as the safety principle. So the same principle is being used here. And the requirement is that any material which comes in direct contact with food or is likely to come in contact with food used for packaging, preparation, storing, wrapping, transportation, and sale or service of food shall be of food grade quality. So this has become an explicit requirement for food contact materials since this regulation has come into effect. And there are many general requirements which are laid down. First is around tin containers that once used, they should not be reused. Then there is a requirement around printing inks that it has to conform to BIS standard 15495. So this is another area that you need to look at, that while this is one regulation, it uses a lot of references to BIS standards. So it just refers to BIS standard, and you will have to look at BIS standard for further specific details on, say, for example, printing inks, that what are that criteria which are specified in that BIS standard, and you have to meet that criteria. And similarly, not only for printing inks, but the kind of materials that you can use for food contact materials is also used as a reference for BIS standards. Then the other general requirement is that the printed surface of packaging material shall not come into direct contact with the food products, and newspaper or any such material shall not be used for storing and wrapping of food. And then there are additional requirements that in case of multi-layer packaging, the layer which comes in direct contact with food, that has to meet the requirements of packaging material which are given in schedule 1, 2, and 3 of these regulations. And then these schedules 1, 2, and 3 gives you list of materials which shall be compatible with their intended use, so as to be safe for use, and so that it does not alter the quality and safety of the food product. And these schedules also make references to BIS standards for those materials. And then every business operator has to obtain a certificate of conformity, which is issued by an NABL accredited laboratory against these regulations, which certifies that this is a food grade material. Now, after those general requirements, this regulation gives you specific requirements for primary food packaging. The first one is paper and board materials, for which you have Schedule 1. Glass containers, which are intended to come in contact with food products. Then metal and metal alloys, which can come in contact with food products, is covered through Schedule 2. And plastic materials is covered through Schedule 3. Then there are requirements that packaging drinking water containers, the transparency level should be not less than 85%. Then there are migration requirements that all packaging materials of plastic origin, the overall migration limit is specified is 60 milligram per kg or 10 milligram per decameter square when they are tested as per this IS standard, with no visible color migration. And apart from this overall migration, there are specific migration limits which are given in table 1, which I'll pick up just after this. And then there are pigments or colors that you can use, which are given in IS 9833. And it also says that products made of recycled plastics, including carry bags, shall not be used for packaging, storing, carrying, or dispensing articles of food. and a suggestive list of packaging materials for certain specific applications is given in Schedule 5, Schedule 4, which is just an indicative list. And this is the specific migration limit for plastic material. So you have seen that there's an overall migration of 60 as a limit, but then this is the specific migration. That means the barium limit should be less than 1, cobalt less than 0.05, and copper less than 5, iron less than 48, lithium zero point 0.6, manganese zero point 0.6, and zinc as 25. And all these values are under as milligrams per kg. Now, so far we have seen the regulation which exists in India, and after this regulation, there is a little bit of change which is happening around use of certain materials which can be recycled and can be still used for food contact applications. That's an area which is evolving. And so now we have seen how this is regulated in Europe, how this is regulated in US, and what are the specific details which are available for India. But if we look at the major regulatory trends, you can see that 4 major regulatory trends are available across the world when it comes to regulating food contact materials. One is that more and more restrictive requirements are coming up when it comes to dealing with some certain sensitive population groups. And when you say sensitive population groups means either say infants or people who are immunocompromised in certain way or certain other specific population group which have a sensitivity of certain kind. That means they need to be treated separately from the general requirements. So this is one trend which is coming up. So you are getting more and more restrictive requirements around that. The other is as science is evolving, there are a lot of new materials which are coming up, and they have potential applications in packaging applications. So a lot of detail and regulatory oversight is coming on to those new, or what in regulatory terminology we say novel materials which have not been used, and these can be materials like nanomaterials which can come into packaging applications. So how do you regulate and how do you establish safety of such materials? Then there is an increased attention to certain chemicals of concern. Most of you might have heard various regulatory developments around BPA in packaging materials and some other such chemicals of concern which are looked at specifically by regulators. And also, there is more and more pressure on companies to use recycled material. So when you are using recycled material for food contact applications, how do you ensure safety of those recycled uh, packaged materials when it comes to application in foods? Even in Indian regulation, use of recycled materials uh, is not allowed explicitly so far. But there is that effort going on to ensure that you establish certain criteria. And if that recycled material complies to that criteria, you can allow its use. And you will see some of those developments coming up soon. So these are the major regulatory trends which are coming up. But overall, you can see that as science is growing, as new and new areas of application is coming up in food contact materials, regulations are trying to play a catch up and trying to build areas and expertise to ensure that there is safety which is established when it comes to use in contact with foods. Uh, with this, I say thank you very much for your time and patience, and I believe we'll have some time for a bit of Q&A at the end of the
Yes, yes,
session.
yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Jasvir. I mean, this was really very insightful, you know, the way you took us through the global regulations regarding packaging and also included the Indian stakes on what regulation are there for food packaging and labeling. So, as rightly said, we will be having a question and answer session towards the end of this session. So now I would like to introduce our next speaker for the day. So the next speaker is Mr. Jatin Tucker. He's the head product safety and regulatory at Siegwerk. He's a seasoned professional with over a decade of experience in the food and packaging industries. He has worked across different verticals like operations, quality, and food safety, as well as regulatory with strong market players like Nestle, Kraft Heinz, and Siegwerk. With his expertise in food safety and his passion for ensuring packaging safety, he's heading an awareness campaign across different stakeholders in the packaging supply chain with the goal of ensuring food safety aspects of the packaging material. He has been deeply involved with various brand owners and regulatory bodies like FSSAI and BIS for raising the bar of the packaging regulations in the country. So I would now request Jatin to continue with his part of the session. I would like to thank you on behalf of Team FICSI that you were able to take your time out and you would agree to do this webinar session with us. Over to you, Jatin.
Thanks, Pratha, for this introduction. And I think looking into the time, I'll directly jump to the presentation. Yeah, just give me 1 second. Just let me know if the screen is visible.
Yes, it is visible.
Okay. So once again, welcome to all. And what I will be talking today would be in continuation to what Dr. Jasvir has already mentioned. So he took care of how the regulatory network is created around the subject of packaging safety, or what we call as food contact materials. And now I'll get into a bit of the technical aspects, and I'll also talk about how we can ensure packaging safety in reality, and what is the future outlook in terms of protecting the consumers. So everyone would agree that packaging is something that we always have believed would protect the food. But now it's very well a known fact that the same packaging which is believed to protect the food can also contaminate the food with chemical contaminants. And before going into the subject, I think the thing that we need to understand is that when we see a packaging material on the shelves from different brand owners, we need to understand that the packaging material that we see in totality is being created because of different components, which includes the substrate, that could be paper, that could be plastic. Then you have adhesives onto it, and then you also have printing inks onto it. So there are multiple components, and hence there are multi-stakeholders in this packaging supply chain. And this makes this supply chain very, very complex. So one thing is that you have a lot of stakeholders, which leads to the production of the packaging material that you see. So even if one of that stakeholder does not perform in the right manner, you cannot have the safe packaging material. The another big concern with the packaging supply chain is that unlike the raw material supply chain, the packaging supply chain is not regulated by FSSAI. What do I mean by that is when you talk about the manufacturers who are supplying the substrates, who are supplying the inks, or who are supplying the adhesives, which actually constitutes the entire packaging material, they're not regulated by FSSAI. They do not come under their scope, and they do not have any legal obligation to match up to the requirements of FSSAI. And for this reason, the entire onus, if you see in the food safety and standard packaging regulation that Dr. Jasvir just briefed, the entire onus is on the brand owners. So this makes the things complex, that you have people who are making the packaging material, not actually the part of the regulation, or the are not under the regulatory are not under the scope of the regulatory body. So in this sense, the problem is complex. Now, let's get into the reason that why we are talking about this subject now. As Dr. Jasvir also mentioned, that the space of packaging safety is evolving. We see a lot of regulations coming up across the globe, and the regulations, even those are existing, are evolving. So with the new information that is being available, the things are getting more and more stringent, and hence it's really important that we pay heed to packaging safety. There's another reason is that these kind of issues, which relates to food safety, I think they draw a lot of consumer and media attention. And it's really important for the brand owners, for the packaging supply chain, to be very, very sensitive on these things. And third, the most important reason, consumer safety. Now, obviously, when you speak to a consumer or a layman, they would say how the packaging can contribute or can lead to the contamination of the food product, right? But I can assure you, I can tell you at least, that if you pick a packaging material on the shelves from the market, then you're actually picking roughly around 150 to 200 chemicals. Yes, that's the magnitude of chemicals that we are talking of. And a major chunk of it, say around 80 to 85% of those chemicals, are only and only coming from packaging inks.
Overview of
And
fruits and
the
vegetables.
another known fact is that many of these chemicals are really hazardous. So we know that there have been chemicals in the past, and maybe there are still chemicals which are being used by the Indian chemical industries. Those chemicals can be carcinogenic, that can lead to cancer. They can be mutagenic, that is, they can alter the genes. They can be reprotoxic, which means they can lead to infertility, or they can lead to damage to the unborn child. And there are also even endocrine disruptors. So these kind of chemicals are in use and have been in use by the chemical industries. And these are the chemicals that becomes the concerns once they reach to the product that we eventually consume. And hence, Dr. Jasvir mentioned that different regulations gives a framework regulation that says that your packaging should not endanger human health. And this means that all these suppliers in the packaging supply chain have to ensure that none of the chemicals that are harmful for the consumers should actually migrate to the food. However, in the past, we have seen scandals arising out of packaging safety. So this is an example from 2008, 2009, where something that was on the packaging material was actually detected in the food, and this led to a recall due to many consumer complaints and order. In this case, the chemicals directly leached out from the packaging material into the food, and this is called the diffusion mechanism. So this is one way by which the chemicals can migrate to your food or your pharma or your cosmetics for that matter. The another way by which these chemicals gets transferred, now you can imagine 2 coffee cups. Maybe once you go to the QSR chains, you have these cups one into the other, and you will realize that a printed side of one cup makes a contact with the unprinted side of the another cup. And later on, you pour your tea or coffee into this cup and you sip that coffee, right? The same thing happens when you have the packaging materials before packing of food. They are either in form of laminates or they are in form of stack of sheets. And what happened is chemical transfer from the printed side to the unprinted side, and this leads to the chemical contamination of the food product later on once the food product makes the contact. And this has actually led to one of the biggest scandal when we talk about packaging safety in the history, which happened in 2005, 2006, where a kind of a chemical called ITX, and this was a bad chemical for obvious reason. This was detected in baby milk and juices. And for this reason, a big recall was initiated in Europe. A lot of us would say that majorly the chemicals must be of a concern when you talk about primary packaging, the packaging that makes a direct contact with the food item. But this is not the case. Even when you talk about these cereal boxes, even your secondary packaging, the outer packaging of the paper and board is also not safe. There has been a case in 2011 where a known brand owner had to recall 28 million cereal boxes. Why? Because the chemicals called mineral oils, which have carcinogenic properties, they were on the outside packaging and somehow they utilized gas as a medium to reach out to the primary packaging, and then these chemicals simply diffused through the packaging to reach out to the cereals. And this is the third mechanisms where they utilize gas as a medium and can reach to the food product. So the things that looks pretty simple, the packaging material that looks very safe may not be actually safe unless and until all the partners of the packaging supply chain are working together in the direction of packaging safety. Going forward, it's really important to raise the bar on packaging safety, and there are 4 key principles here. The thing that is really required in the Indian market is to create more awareness among the packaging supply chain. As has been explicitly mentioned that the subject is not very known, at least for the Indian market. The kind of awareness that should be there is not existing. And another thing that adds to this fact of low awareness is that the packaging components are created by the chemical companies, which are not actually the custodians for food safety. So they do not have any know-how or any knowledge about food safety. So suppose someone who is actually using the packaging material is not creating it, and the government is asking the brand owner who is placing the packaging material on shelf to regulate it without bringing the other chemical suppliers into the scope. And here the responsibility of regulators and more importantly, the brand owners becomes very, very important. So it's really required that there has to be more awareness on this subject of packaging safety. Another important thing that we need to do is create monitoring and auditing protocols. As mentioned, the chemical companies are not so good when it comes to food safety because they're chemical companies. So we need to put auditing protocols where the custodians, the brand owners, need to audit how the chemicals are being regulated by the chemical suppliers to ensure consumer safety. It's really required in that sense. The third important reason is developing specifications. There has to be a means by which the brand owners should cascade their requirements very precisely to the chemical suppliers, like the chemical suppliers who provide the substrate, inks, or adhesive. Now, we need to understand that these brand owners have big regulatory teams, so they have these regulatory professionals who can read and interpret the regulations for them. But unfortunately, the chemical industries do not have these kind of regulatory professionals. So it's a responsibility of the brand owners to cascade the information very precisely in the forms of specifications to these chemical suppliers so that they can do justice when it comes to chemical safety or packaging safety. And another thing that needs to be done is to promote transparency and integration among the supply chain partners. It's really important that the chemical suppliers transparently discloses what kind of chemicals they are using. And there is an integration of the packaging supply chain. So everybody comes together and make sure that they are doing the right thing to ensure the packaging safety towards the end of the supply chain. Now, just to give some outlook for the future, what we expect and what's required to protect the consumers for the future. So number one requirement is to create awareness, create collaboration, and create platforms just like the one where we are, created by FICSI. So just to give you example, now toluene is a chemical that has been legally banned now, but still this chemical you can find at least in 40–50% of the market that's right now operating. And this is only for the reason that probably the big brand owners are very well aware and they have made the required changes, but still a lot of small and mid-sized players are not well informed. And hence, there is a need to create these awareness campaigns, collaborations, and platforms to cascade that information down the line, even to the small and mid-sized players, to take the right direction when it comes to packaging safety. Another thing is called mineral oils. It's a chemical that you will find in, I think, 90% of more than 90% of the cartons that you buy. So this is a chemical which is known to have carcinogenic properties, used in more than 90% of the market, for the simple reason that there is no awareness around this. And this has to change. We need to create awareness, collaboration, and platform. Another thing, this is a reiteration of what I have already said. The chemicals classification changes over time. So something that was safe 2 years before may not be safe today. So we need to make sure that the packaging supply chain is very much transparent and integrated. Now, here, just to cite an example, suppose a chemical classification changes. Now, in no ways a brand owner can understand that because they are dealing with food safety. And hence, it will be a responsibility of the chemical supplier to notify to the brand owners. But this is only possible when we bring transparency and integration in the packaging supply chain. And lastly, I come to the last slide of my presentation. So there have been some recent developments, and now we are talking about sustainability, circular economy. We are talking about use of recycled plastics, even for food packaging. Now, this is an area I think which needs much more discussions and deliberations. So when we see the laws existing today, they may be sufficient to take care of the virgin plastic materials, but may or may not be sufficient to take care of the recycled plastics, because a lot is going to happen when you put the plastics for recycling. And unless and until that is celebrated and discussed by the authorities with the responsible stakeholders, it will be an area which can lead to serious consumer safety concerns. As of now, there are three must-dos, I think, for protecting our future. We do not have a law in India, at least as of now, which bans the use of chemicals that falls into particular hazardous categories. So there is no such law that explicitly prohibits the use of these kind of chemicals in food packaging, at least, or pharma or hygiene and cosmetics, at least for the sensitive packaging applications. There's nothing where we are upgrading our regulations with respects to existing and emerging risks like recyclability. And then we need to lay the foundation for harmonizing our standards with the global standard. It's required because you cannot hope for a sustainable future if you do not protect the lives. So I think safety and sustainability has to go hand in hand. Today, if everyone is talking about recyclability, we should not forget that we can save the environment, but we may lose out on the humans in itself. So it's really important that we pay equal heed to safety and sustainability. And with this, I close my session and thank you for patiently hearing me out. And now probably we can take some question and answers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jatin, for giving us such a good presentation. And this was really very insightful. And as you rightly and very appropriately pointed out that we cannot discuss each and every aspect of packaging in just one seminar or in a webinar. So for the participants who have joined us today, I'm very happy to tell you that in the coming months we will be planning more sessions to give you better and clearer ideas and concepts about different aspects of food packaging. So Jatin has been kind enough and he has agreed to collaborate with FICSI and come up with more such interesting sessions in the following months. So with this, I'm opening the deck for question and answer session. So if you have any questions, please make sure that you write it down in the chat box, which is now accessible. So we'll take the questions. We'll take a couple of questions, and I hope our speakers will be able to answer those for you. At the same time, by the time you are writing down your questions. We will be sharing a link, a feedback link with all of you for your feedback of today's webinar. Once you fill in the details and give us your feedback, you will be receiving a certificate of participation from FICSI for attending this webinar. So I would request all of you to kindly put in the chat box your name and your email IDs so that we can have a record of it. And also, I would like to let you know that we are organizing uh, a training program on food safety and standards packaging and labeling guidelines on 26th April. That's Tuesday next week. The details of this program I will be sharing towards the end of this session. I can share it right now also. I would request Kamal from my team to share the details. So I think we can start taking the questions. The questions are flowing in the chat box. So the first question is from Saujanya. He is asking, is it mandatory to make testing for BPA in all packaging? Jasvir ji, Jatin ji, do you want to take this question?
Well, in Indian regulations, the testing requirement is for getting a certificate of conformity that the material is food grade. Beyond that, it has not specified that whether you need to do testing for A, B, or C.
Okay. There is another question. He's asking, what is the difference between migration and diffusion, and what are the various ways to prevent it? Migration and diffusion. I think this might require a bigger answer, but if in concise, one of you can take this question and answer it shortly, I think even that would suffice.
Yes, so I can take this up. So first of all, migration refers to the transfer of chemicals from packaging to the product, which could be food, pharma, hygiene. And there are different means. So diffusion and other means are just the ways by which these can migrate, which I just explained. And the possible solutions is to have certain kind of barrier coatings or maybe responsibly source your packaging components. So your chemical suppliers have to be vigilant what kind of chemicals they are using. So these are the only two solutions to ensure food safety through packaging materials.
Looking at more questions. I think that's all I have questions, that is coming in the chat right now.
Saujanya is asking, sir, is there any effect of ink leaching from matte finish packaging or BOPP coated packaging?
Yeah, I can take this up. So yes, if you have your matte finishes, it's ultimately an ink or varnish that is being used, and a leachability effect could be seen in those cases. Yep.
Shushma wants to know,
the last question.
In any food labeling, now it's mandate from FICSI to place the packaging vendor license. Being a consumer, can one reach out the packer on the food safety?
I did not get the question. I mean,
She wants to know, as per FSSI mandate, that food labeling is now on every packaging with vendor license. So being a consumer, can one reach out the packer on the food safety?
well, you have the license number. You also have customer care details, which are mandatory on packs, and any consumer can contact the company using those contact details. it is within their legal rights to do that.
I think we'll take one last question. There is one question. Why is instant soup noodles pouring hot water not banned yet? The material leaching is possible. Is it possible? I mean, that's what they're trying to ask here.
See, the migration limits are defined in the regulation. And if your material complies to the requirement of regulations, you can use that material. And hence, whether you use hot water or any other hot medium, if the material is still safe for use as packaging as per regulation, you can very well use it. And I believe that the instant noodle making companies have tested that and ensured that they are using those materials.
Okay, fair enough. So I think that's about the questions that we are going to take for this session. So I would request all others to kindly give their feedback, and if you have any other questions that you want us to answer, you can mention it in the feedback form also. Finally, to wind up the session today, I would really like to thank Dr. Jasvir and Jatin. On behalf of Team FICSI, we are really very elated, that you chose to do this webinar session with us. We hope, that together we can collaborate more and do many more such interesting sessions, that will benefit the food industry and also all the aspiring food technologists who want to enter the food industry and gain some knowledge about the various topics, that are of interest. Another thing that I would want to let you all know that, the recording of today's session will be available on our YouTube channel. I would definitely urge you to, if you have not already followed us on LinkedIn and Instagram or Facebook, please make sure, that you do subscribe and like our page. And what this will do is, we keep on having many interesting sessions. So once you follow us, you will get to know what all sessions we are doing, and you will also get an access to all the material that is available with us. So thanks again everyone for joining us today. I hope you had a very good session. Thanks again Jasvir ji and Jatin ji. I hope all of you all have a very good weekend. The details of the program, the training program that we are conducting on 26th is shared on the screens in front of you, and we'll be sharing the registration link again, on the chat. So make sure, if you want to attend this program, we would be very happy to have you on board. Thanks, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
I hope you had a very fruitful session. Thank you, Jasvir ji. Thank you,
Thank
Jatin.
you.
Bye, everyone. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.